Hello, BSides Columbus attendees. Thank you for attending my session today, which is titled Lend Me Your IRs. My name is Matt Shear. People may follow me on Twitter at C3RKAH. Also, I have my LinkedIn contact information on this slide. Anybody interested in obtaining a copy of the slide deck from my talk may do so at slideshare.net/circa. Let's begin. A couple quick things about me is I work for a big, well-known organization as an InfoSec engineer performing DFIR on a CCERT. I also run the SIMPA Security SIG, which is a local information security meetup group based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Quick disclaimer is that yes, I do have a day job. However, opinions expressed are based solely on my own independent security research and do not express or reflect the views or opinions of my employer. My objectives are to show live demo reenactments of real attacks, how these real world attacks worked, how and why they defeated security solutions, show incident response to these attacks, and demo investigation tools and techniques, along with discussing lessons learned and key takeaways. Some of the acronyms I might use during this talk are IOC or IOC, IR for incident response, DFIR, which is digital forensics and incident response, just to make sure that we're all starting on the same page. Other disclaimers are that the demos I'm giving are based on 100% true stories. These demos dutifully recreate actual attacks. However, some details were altered. Investigation demos are sped up considerably in the interest of allotted presentation time. Attendees should only perform these techniques in a dedicated, securely isolated, and volatile sandbox. Now, something with my talk today is I'm doing live demos on a host laptop. This is a local system. When the real investigations happen, those were done within a sandboxed environment. So for the purposes of this talk, let's please just use a pretend sandbox when I'm doing these demos, how it was originally done. The first scenario I'd like to start with is called the mystery attachment. To set the preface for this, there was a news headline from August 17th of 2018, mouse spam campaign targets banks using Microsoft Publisher. The reason this is a little unusual is not that malicious threat actors were sending email messages, phishing email messages with malicious attachments. It's just typically when you see those things, they're very often Microsoft Office documents like Word or Excel rather than PowerPoint, or another thing that is commonly used is Adobe PDF files. The flawed Amy rat was part of the Nakurs botnet as reported by researchers at TrustWave, and I've got a link to that original article. The unusualness of leveraging Microsoft Publisher and the fact that it was targeted against banks got picked up in the news cycle by quite a number of other places. 1 week later, I'm sitting at my desk, dutifully working on probably a number of things at the same time, when somebody comes up to my desk and I can see that they're very anxious and a little frantic and telling me, Matt, help. One of our VIPs with access to lots of very sensitive information just got hit in that recent mouse spam campaign targeting banks. It matches the IOCs from the reports of that new flawed Amy rat, which is part of the Nakurs botnet. The recipient attempted to open the Microsoft Publisher attachment on their smartphone. I need you to drop whatever you're doing and investigate this. We'll get you the attachment ASAP. And just sort of important to note here that when I was first approached, I'm thinking, all right, another thing to investigate and look into. But as the individual kind of stood there and kept talking and saying, oh, this matches perfectly the things that we're seeing in the news about this most recent threat, sort of, I started getting amped up listening to them tell me about this stuff. And once I got the attachment, I just really started tearing into it. So what I'd like to do today is open the file, demo in the sandbox. We're going to do detonation, research attempts, and failure to understand anything about this malicious file as well as I can. Also want to showcase some other tools I use when I am looking at a file I don't know a lot about, such as strings. We'll do some hashing and simulated online research. And then we'll look at the EXIF data, which was sort of this fleeting thought I had as I was pondering my next steps. So with that, let me go ahead and open up the file here. In here you see in the folder, I've got the Microsoft Publisher file. Now, when I open this up, it's going to open up in LibreOffice Draw on my system. In reality, the sandbox I had access to really did have Microsoft Publisher installed on it. So again, just sort of pretend this is our sandbox and we're in Publisher. And the document really looks something like this. It's pretty typical of a lot of malware I've seen. And it would come up and say, macros have to be enabled to essentially see the contents of the document, and please click the enable content button. The trick for me was I couldn't actually get this to pop up. I tried a number of different things and just couldn't get it to work. And was sort of scratching my head about that and contemplating and wondering why that was. Also poked around Publisher for a little bit, but I'm not very familiar with that particular application. So I really couldn't find the macros I was looking for. Really just sort of threw me off a little bit. So this was the kind of thing that I had uploaded to our automated sandbox to do detonation and see what it would find out, and hopefully get a disposition on whether the document was malicious and how it might be malicious. So while I'm looking at that and kind of letting it go through, I decide that I'm going to go ahead and run strings against this file to see what's in it. So I'm going to go ahead and run the strings command, specify the file name. What I like to do is pipe the strings command to less. What that lets me do is that lets me just slowly review the file. I can even look at things line by line if I want to. Otherwise, it would just scroll through the screen all the way straight to the end, and I wouldn't see the stuff leading up to that. Strings command, what it does is it strips out human readable text from most any file, and in this case, it comes up and looking at some stuff that turns out to definitely indicate this is a legitimate Microsoft Publisher file. And I started looking through some of the text that pulled out. Fortunately, I didn't really find anything interesting, just some basic commands. Like I didn't find comment code or other things that might be in human readable text format that would tip me off as to what this is or how it might work. So unfortunately, that was a dead end for me. What I decided to do while I was waiting, and certainly you could get the hash values from the sandbox detonation with most sandboxes. However, what I decided to do is do some online research. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the SHA-256 sum for this particular file and see what I get. And so here's the hash value of the file itself. One thing it's important to note is you sort of have to understand what tools you have in your environment and the types of tools and utilities that you might use, and really know what the hashing algorithms, the supported ones are in any particular given environment. In my case at the time, SHA-256 was universally supported across most everything. There's some tools and services that might still only support something like MD5. And the reality is, during the investigation, I probably looked at some of the other hashing algorithms as well. But again, in the interest of time, we'll just use this for our demo. So I had the hash value, and armed with that, I decided to go online and see what I could find out. So what I did is I decided to search for this hash value in VirusTotal. Of course, VirusTotal gets a lot of submissions every day, and chances are very good if there's some repurposed malware that it will find it, because what VirusTotal, of course, does is they use 70 some odd search, antivirus scan engines to analyze the file to see what it can detect. So fairly unusual when you have a file and VirusTotal has never seen it before. So while that was a dead end, I decided to look at a similar service called Jotty Malware Scan. Went ahead and searched for the hash value there. So it's one of these interesting things where Jotty doesn't have as many AV scan engines as VirusTotal does, but you never know from one engine to another which one might have slightly more updated virus definitions. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap here, but maybe there's potentially a couple new pieces of AV engines between the two as well. Unfortunately, you can see I searched for the hash value and it just didn't return any results. So I decided to run the search through hybrid analysis, and that's another sort of a third-party sandbox platform on the web. And surprised again that didn't see it either. Um, so it was, a little bit disheartening that I couldn't find this particular file being seen anywhere else. Um, so I just went for broke and searched for some hashing algorithms on Google. And no matter how I tried it, I just didn't get any results back as well. And so some of the questions I'm sort of pondering in my own mind at this point are, could this be a 0-day variant of that particular malicious file? What other things may have been done? Could it have been re-encoded, or could it even been modified specifically to target our organization? So these are very concerning ideas that I had. And go back to the slide deck here. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, I also spent a great deal of time doing research on flawed AMI, on the curs, looking at the IOCs that have been reported, trying to see if I can draw some correlations between those and what I'm seeing that will sort of help me prove out what this thing is and how it's working, what it does. And unfortunately, I just couldn't piece anything together. I couldn't get a match here. So then my mind immediately shifts to, all right, I've looked through this thing as well as I could. I haven't done an attempted memory forensics on it, but the tools I have are basically running for desktop OSs as an example. And this device happened to be an iPhone. So things are going to behave differently from one platform to another, different hardware. All these things come into play. Also, if there's some sort of anti-forensics built into these things to make them hard to detect, um, the options I'm thinking are, well, it's somewhat unlikely that a publisher file could execute malware on an iPhone, but I can't prove that it doesn't. So, but I didn't really have a risk tolerance for just kind of letting it ride, assuming that the infection was likely low. Um, Another option was to perhaps do a security wipe on the device and hope that's good enough to essentially remove anything that may have been dropped onto this mobile device. But that didn't really seem like something I wanted to accept the risk on either, simply because I couldn't prove or disprove that it was clean, since I couldn't really understand the infection itself. So really my last thought is it's time to probably just look at confiscating this device, shutting it down, essentially inventorying it inside of our digital forensics lab, and go about getting this individual new device. I looked, they weren't quite due for a refresh yet. However, they were within 6 months of qualifying for a refresh device. So I started feeling comfortable with that as probably my best course of action. But the interesting thing is I thought, well, this is kind of silly, but I actually didn't take the time to look at the EXIF properties. So in a Microsoft Windows environment, to look at EXIF properties for something like a publisher file, you would simply right click on that file, go into the properties, and then start looking at the details. And those will show you things like maybe who authored it. You get a lot of other potential information if there's, copyrights. Sometimes with image files, you can get geographic data. Just some things you can do to maybe get some sort of attribution. But you always have to take that with a big grain of salt, because EXIF data can be spoofed. But it's still something I hadn't looked at, and was kind of surprised that I didn't take time to look at that. So let's go ahead and do something like that. Since I'm not in a Windows environment, I'm going to use the Perl EXIF tool to take a look at this particular file. And so when that comes up, some of the things, I get about the EXIF tool itself, the file name, the file size, some really good information around the timestamp, particularly with the file modification date time. This would give me a clue when the file really came into being. You see more current things where it's accessed and things have changed, but the file modification date and time could be an important indicator. Some things that were a little bit unusual is, since I don't spend a lot of time looking at publisher files, were the file type extension, and the MIME type here. So those definitely struck me as being a little unusual. So I actually researched those online and found out that yes, this is what legitimate Microsoft publisher files look like. And certainly it's telling me it's a publisher file. I get down to the author. Now, it didn't actually come out and say test phish. It was actually similar enough to that. What it was this facepalm moment where it had our test phishing vendor's name in it. And for me, sort of embarrassing when I realized that the email attachment I just spent hours looking at actually came from our test phishing vendor. Now, that's okay if you want to go ahead and laugh at my pain here, but I want to talk about some of the lessons I learned from that. Now, again, I talked about EXIF data could be spoofed, so I didn't want to just trust that. So what I did is I went back to our secure email gateway and looked at the message headers from this. And if it was supposed to come from our test phishing vendor, it looked like what I would expect. Of course, I looked at it like, yes, Matt, this really is your test phishing vendor's IP address, you dolt. So what went wrong here? I got caught up in the moment, really, by subconsciously letting somebody else influence my investigation. Their anxiety and bad assumptions wore off on me. So I should have started with the message headers first, which is what I typically do when I investigate phishing messages. This one time I abandoned my own standards by focusing on the file attachment first. And ironically, I've given phishing forensics talks, and that's where I always start with the headers. The one time I don't, sure enough, it comes back to bite me. So let's talk about the remediation. Really, in this case, it was just a road to redemption. There were painful lessons learned for reminders to stick to my standard investigative processes and procedures. If I would have started with my investigation by inspecting the message headers first, I could have closed out this investigation in minutes instead of hours. And since it was testing, there was no further actions that were required. My next scenario is called security scanner evasion. Just to set the table for this, identical phishing emails started hitting inboxes, and we started getting wide-scale reports of phishing coming in. Usually those reports sort of trickle in throughout the course of a day, but within a relatively short period of time, we had a huge influx of these pouring in. Really got my attention as something that we need to look at sooner rather than later. So the phishing page link within the email, once I pulled it back and saw what it was, it no longer appeared to be working in my security scanner. So I had to ask, was the malicious site taken offline already? Maybe if this thing's been shut down, it's something we don't actually need to worry about. So let's investigate and find out. For the investigation, we'll look at the email message source code, and I'm going to demo that. And again, this is our pretend sandbox environment. And look for hyperlinks. We'll check the landing page with a security scanner. I'm going to simulate that. And then we'll look at the landing page source code, again, in our pretend sandbox. And then we'll also open the phishing page in that just to see what it looks like. So let's go ahead and take a look at this phishing email. Oops. Hold on, we'll get to that one here in a moment. All right, here's the phishing email I was looking for. So this comes in, and it's a, I know the short headers are probably a little hard to read, but it's from Evil Scammer at promisewearelegit.com. The subject is, this link is totally safe, and it's targeting an unwitting victim. And it looked something close to this. Hello, phishing target. We have a really important message for you. To retrieve your message, click here. That's not real subtle. And then regards, spoof sender. So let's go ahead and look at the header or the message source on this and see what we can learn. And I'll make this a bit bigger so it's easier for everybody to see. I'm going to search for HTTP, and here's the text here on the click here that we saw within the email itself. But here's the address where it's actually going. So again, what I want to do is throw this into a security scanner tool to understand what this is and how it behaves. So I want to see screenshots of what it looks like. I want to see source code, things like that. So I put this in our security scanner solution, and it comes back with a server 404 error, essentially telling me that the content is no longer there. It was there, it's just not there. So it, by all appearances, at this point, looks like it's been taken offline. If that's the case, then perhaps this is something we don't have to worry about. But I had a little bit of concerns and wanted to take a look at this a little bit further. So let's go ahead and get the source code from this and see what that looks like. There's a couple options for this. I'm going to show you a couple of them. So I'm going to use curl with the address, and let me put this down. We're going to output this to something we'll call unknown.html, and we retrieved it. Now, if we don't have curl available on the system, or maybe not comfortable with it, there's always a tried and true utility like wget. In this case, it's wget, put in the site address, and retrieve the file that way. Now, if I take a look at what we have for HTML files, we'll see the two files that I pulled down. Unknown is what we pulled from curl, and index is what we pulled down using wget. You will notice that they are the same file size. One thing to be aware of in this demo, since I'm retrieving the file from a local server, the local machine server, I'm getting the original time date stamp on this as opposed to when I actually pulled it down. In the real world, if you're using wget to pull down files from a remote server on the internet, for example, you'll actually get a more recent timestamp for when it should reflect when you actually made the request and the file was pulled down. So that's a little bit of an anomaly here, but I do want to show folks that they really are forensically the same file. So we'll do a SHA-256 sum value of HTML files. And here we can see we have an exact match for both files. So we know this really is the same. So it's one of these things where you can really sort of use whatever works for you in this instance, what your best option might be. So now that we have the file, let's actually go ahead and take a look at that. I'm just going to pull one of these up here in a text editor. We'll just look at the index HTML. And that's going to open it up in our text editor. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And what we have here is really just a typical HTML file. And then we get here to what is really JavaScript. And so what it's doing is it's saying if navigator, user agent, index of, and we start seeing common web browsers such as Chrome, Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera, and Safari. And what's interesting is notice that they're really kind of going to the same page. And this location replace is essentially doing a redirect. What gets very interesting here at the bottom is we see an else statement. So if these conditions aren't met, then it's actually sending the visitor somewhere else. And what I believe the threat actor is doing here is they're checking to make sure that before they send somebody to a malicious page, that it really is a legitimate web browser and not some security scanner. Because if it's not spoofing one of these common browser user agents, it's never going to see it. It's going to go to the our fake 404 page. But if it is one of these browsers, it will send the traffic somewhere else. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and see what that looks like for real. And we'll put in the website address here. And here we have a Microsoft Office 365 credential harvesting page. It's not really Office 365. It's just something threat actors has set up to collect people's usernames and passwords. From there, they can do obviously a lot of bad things. So with that, now understanding how this works a little bit, let's go back, and we've seen this. We talked about the evasion code and how it works using the browser's user agent string. In this case, I got really lucky because the threat actors had used JavaScript, which is a client-side language, meaning I actually see all the code when I pull it down. If the threat actor, though, had used a server-side language like, PHP, Python, or any of a number of other ones, I would not be able to see the source code without some sort of special access privilege to the server itself. Something you're unlikely to have when it comes to third-party internet sites. So I was able to see it and understand the code. If they had used one of these server-side languages, I still would have been able to tell a redirect happened and ultimately know where it goes, but I wouldn't necessarily see it underneath the hood perspective of how it works. And then some other thoughts I had that would have made this also harder would be if they were targeting specific browsers. So let's use a hypothetical example where maybe malicious threat actors have a Mozilla Firefox exploit, and they have a page set up to essentially launch an exploit kit against site visitors if they are using Firefox. They could actually filter out everybody else, and really what they can do is send everybody else to a real page. If it's Firefox, they could send them to a page that has the exploit kit on it, execute that, and then round robin redirect them to the real page. And all that tends to happen fast enough that most site visitors aren't even going to notice that split second, less than a split second probably, that it takes for that to happen. So definitely some things that could have been done that would make that harder. And going a step further with that, let's say the exploit kit for Firefox they had only worked on certain versions. They can actually check the versions, use essentially really to focus on just the vulnerable versions. And that really makes it harder to detect and know it's something you should block, because then the scope gets really narrow of what they're targeting. So definitely some scary thoughts around that. The remediation plan in this case were to determine the actual phishing landing page and block through web content filtering. We also worked with our secure email gateway vendor to block the phishing campaign. I believe we also made sure that the message was quarantined throughout the environment following that. So that's what we did to address that problem. The third scenario I'd like to cover is something I call the rabbit hole. And set the table for this. I received a request from a user to investigate an email message they received to determine if it was legitimate or not. The email appeared fishy at first glance, but I had to ask the question, is it just suspicious or is it malicious? Now, is it just suspicious or is it malicious is actually a phishing forensics talk I've given several places. If you're interested in looking at that, you can search YouTube for BSides Cleveland in that title. That's probably the best recorded version of that is out there. The investigation from this point was, I could tell from the message headers that the source IP address was a mismatch for the sender domain. The email message source code was particularly interesting, and in particular because the link text didn't match the hyperlink destination. We're going to look at that here in just a moment. The malicious threat actor's objective appeared to be credential harvesting, and we'll see what that looked like for the purposes of account takeover. So let's go ahead and pull up the right phishing email for this one and see what that looked like. So here we have an email message, and in our case, it's supposedly coming from PayPal support. But what we notice, the actual email address is listed as ppsupport@pwn-server.org. It's got a subject of PayPal bank account change confirmation, and it's targeting an unwitting victim again. And so when we see change confirmation, if you have a PayPal account and didn't make changes to it, and you get an email notification like this, might be something that you get inquisitive about and want to take a look at. So looking at this, dear PayPal customer, we received your request to update your bank account on file. This process will complete in the next 4 hours. If you did not request these changes to your PayPal account, please log in to reject the pending activity. And here we see the PayPal address. And interestingly enough, if you went to the PayPal address you see here, it would take you to the real sign-in page for PayPal. But all's not quite as it seems. And we'll take a look at the message source here. But I did want to highlight that this 4-hour window is designed to instill a sense of urgency. If I see that bank account changes have supposedly been made to my PayPal account, and I know I didn't make them as an end user, I might be inclined to want to hop on right away and block these changes from happening to protect my account. We're going to go ahead and look at the message source here, though. Let me pull that up. And then we're going to take a look at that link that we talked about. So here, what we see is we have the PayPal address that we saw in the email. And again, that's the legitimate address that you would use to log into PayPal. However, the hyperlink isn't going to what we see in the link text. It's actually going to this other domain. So we want to take a look at that. In particular, this is a .be domain, which means it's in Belgium. Not something I would necessarily expect to see from a legitimate PayPal account. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like in our pretend sandbox. And what we have here is something that would resemble a PayPal login. I've made it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. But it definitely isn't where we would expected it to. So let's go ahead and use curl, and we'll pull this site down and look at the source code here. And I'm going to output that to first page .html. Now that we have it, let me clear this up, and let's go ahead and take a look at this inside of a text editor. And you can use the editor of your choice. I'm just trying to make this easy for demonstration purposes here. But really, it's just a very small HTML file, and certainly doesn't really have content like we would expect to see if it was a live page. So what we notice is there's a meta tag here, an HTTP meta tag with refresh. And content equals 0 means it happens right away. So there's no 5-second delay, for example, like you would see if you had the number 5 in here. And we've got this other address that doesn't match the first one. And we know that because we see .de domain would indicate that it's a German website domain. So sort of unusual because we knew we started with Belgium, but now we're going to a different place. So let's go to our slide deck and catch back up here. The destination, it was hosted in one foreign country. It didn't stop there though. So we see now that we've got a second country, and it doesn't stop there. And so let's go ahead and get the page source code and find out what's going on there. And we'll use the same method. I'm just going to use curl, the web domain. And we're going to output that to second page.html. And we'll take a look at that in our editor. And again, pretty short file, not really much like we would expect to find in contents. But we don't see an HTTP meta refresh like we did before. What we do see, though, is an iframe. And here we seem to have another domain, and it's even in yet another country, the Netherlands. So already we've got several layers of obfuscation here. So we've got the link text not matching the landing page. It's one layer of obfuscation. It's not going to a real page, but that page is actually redirecting to another page, another good layer of obfuscation. And then that page is serving up content from somewhere else. And we see here that the when we look at this, we understand that it's essentially a borderless, seamless iframe. So it's going to look like you're actually visiting this page when you're actually at the other site. And some obviously bad things that can happen for the PayPal account are that it could, when somebody has those credentials, they can use it to transfer money to accounts, do fake purchases, maybe even as far as a fake online store where they're just collecting the money on the back end and not providing any services or shipping goods. So these are definitely concerning things. Let's go ahead and grab this third page and see what we have here. So we'll go ahead and grab this content and see what's here. So we'll go ahead and pull this back. I'm going to go ahead and run curl and put in this other domain, and we'll go ahead and output this, and we'll call it third page .html. Now we have that. We will go ahead and take a look at the contents of this file as well. Let me clear this up here a little bit. And now we've got something like we haven't seen before. Instead of a page or a redirect of any sort, we've got some JavaScript. We've got this document right, and we've got an unescaped sequence and what appears to be a bunch of gobbledygook. This is encoded content. And I'm just going to theorize in looking at this that what we have is a function that's being fed back into this unescaped sequence. Now, in the olden days, to essentially look at this, what we would have to do is we would have to unescape this out to essentially get the formula to feed the function content back into so we can see and understand what's happening here. So all of this is getting really interesting really fast because, again, these are yet more layers of obfuscation piled into what we've already looked at. I talked about what we had to do in the olden days to kind of reverse this by hand. Fortunately, the thing to remember is that if something can be rendered inside of a web browser, then it has to be something that can be decoded. Otherwise, you would never be able to see it in the browser when you visit the page. So what I'm going to do here is pull up this final landing page, and it's again just what we looked at before, but instead of the iframe, we're actually at the real page content now, where this actually exists, or what we think it does. We kind of have to understand the page code first. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the developer tools inside of Chrome, and I want to go back to this page and refresh it just to make sure that we're feeding in the content that we want to look at. Let me go to here. I brought up the wrong one here. Hold on. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click in here. Oops, that's the wrong one. Let me go here to elements. Here we go. This is what I want to look at. We'll edit as HTML. And sure enough, this matches the text file we were just looking at. So this has that encoded unescaped sequence, the function. Now I made this purposely more readable, which is hard to believe because we're still looking at encoded content, right? But the fact is, with the white space, you can see this unescaped sequence. You see the function JavaScript up here. In real life, you may see this whole thing all bunched together with no spacing whatsoever. So you start looking for some of the telltale signs like the semicolon inside the parentheses, things like that. So I talked about how the browser decodes it. The neat thing here is if we scroll all the way down, we actually finally get to the decoded content that the browser is rendering. So here we actually see that decoded or unescaped rather formula that is feeding, sure enough, a function into it. And I expected to see regular HTML code, but what was interesting is some of the early stuff were actually more encoded content. Looking at the line in front of this, it's telling me that the MIME type is a data image X icon. And here we can tell, because it's listed as base64, that it is base64 encoded content. So it's a relatively big blob of stuff here. if I scroll down past this, then I start getting into the actual HTML code, and I got a little fast there. So here's regular code, and then we find yet another base64 encoded blob within this same web that we're looking at. So this is a little bit unusual. If I do scroll past this, again, I see more traditional HTML like I would expect. So looking at at this blob right here, the bigger of the two, there are some neat tools built in that help us with this. So if I click on the data image that it pulled down inside the developer tools, here we can see that same line we had before. That's a JPEG image. It's base64 encoded. And this is the same blob of stuff that we had. What's really neat is instead of having to decode this by hand, we can actually click on the preview tab here and see that it's a PayPal logo. And if we go back to the page, sure enough, that matches what we're looking at. So we've actually found the graphic image. But when we go back to developer tools, we didn't really pull back any other image files. That's the only one. And if you remember, we actually had two base64 encoded items. So we'll go ahead and talk about what it takes to decode that by hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down and copy down this whole blob, and we'll throw it into a text editor and save it out, and talk about what we do to decode that. So I've done that now. Let me go ahead and go back to the text editor and paste this in here. And this is that same blob we were looking at. Let's go ahead and save this out. And we'll go ahead and call it icon.txt based on the MIME type that we saw, and see what we have. I'm going to go ahead and save that and come back to our text editor. And I'm going to use the base64 command and do a -D to decode, do a -I to just sort of ignore any errors it might have with it. And we'll go ahead and, do that against the icon.txt file. I'm going to redirect the output of this decode into something I'm going to guess is favicon.ico. When I do that, I end up with that completing. And let's go ahead and take a look in our folder and see what we have. Here's the favicon file. I'm going to make this much bigger so it's easier to see. And I guess I'm going to guess here, if we go back to our web browser, that we should see that rendered in the session itself. And might be a little bit small, but here we have the icon within the file here. So at this point, we have a real good idea of what we're looking at, that it really is the proper favicon file. So let's go ahead and catch back up on the slide deck. We've looked at the source code. We found the encoded content, and we used JavaScript encoding. Well, the threat actors use JavaScript encoding to avoid analysis and detection while hiding the page source code, the true source code. We decoded the page using built-in browser developer tools. We looked at encoded elements, and I'm not sure whether they did that simply to further avoid analysis and detection, or they just simply wanted a one-page file, and base64 encoding those image files, and the favicon was a way to keep that as one page. But whatever their rationale for doing it the way they did, we did decode that using the built-in tools, and we also did that by hand. The remediation plan in this case was we determined the final phishing landing page, and we blocked it through web content filtering. We then blocked intermediary compromised web servers through web content filtering. Then we reported compromised websites to domain owners using and their hosting companies through Whois contact records. So that's what I have for demos for this talk. In closing, I will be hanging around online. As you see me hanging around online, please share your own DFIR stories with me. With that, I want to say, friends, Romans, BSides Columbus attendees, lend me your IRs. I will stick around and be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Please hit me up online through the conference, and I'll be happy to chat. I want to thank everybody very much for attending. I appreciate you checking out my session. Thank you very much. Goodbye.